urgent. Kyiv has laid its trump cards on the table. Poland's plan didn't work after all. Budanov announced that Ukraine has seized the political advantage and reshaped the situation in its favor. Tusk goes against Navrotsky. The opponent's clever plan has failed. Meanwhile, a red light has started flashing for Putin. In the Russian army, they're already openly talking about mutiny, and the Kremlin is being directly warned. Weapons could be turned in the opposite direction. A signal that is impossible to ignore. Total shock. Lukashenko has changed his tune, telling Russia to its face that he doesn't want war. Ambiguous statements and the intrigue that Minsk has saved for dessert. Sensation, the United States has sided with Ukraine. Macron revealed Trump's secret. This will finally shut Moscow down. Everything is already filed away in folders. And all of this happened right now. Greetings, I'm Daryna Gutskalo, and we're getting started. This is truly hard to believe. Ukraine outplayed Poland and emerged victorious from a high-profile political standoff.
This isn't the peak yet, believe me. There's more to come, as they say, if everyone doesn't stop just a little bit.
At the same time, Ukraine's Vice Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko reported the signing of 160 agreements worth over 10 billion euros. Following the conference in Gdansk.
This day confirmed once again that Ukraine and Europe share a common path, common values, and a common future.
In turn, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, opening an international meeting in Gdansk dedicated to Ukraine's reconstruction, called it part of a great mission to unite Europe. And immediately the political context adds tension. Alexander Kwasniewski warns that the Ukrainian issue will be one of the key ones in the upcoming elections in Poland. At the same time, Tusk speaks of the possibility of a shared future for Poles and Ukrainians, but only on the basis of truth and mutual respect.
PS will pursue a policy of radicalizing rhetoric regarding Ukraine to stop the trend of votes shifting to the further right, like Confederation and the Confederation of the Crown. Both confederations have difficult relations with PIS, but are seen as their main partners for a coalition.
Analysts say directly that this conflict seemed almost inevitable. The only question was exactly what pretext would trigger it. Therefore, PS needs tension with Ukraine as a political tool. And all of this looks like an internal game where Ukraine becomes part of the struggle for electoral influence and the redistribution of sympathies on the right wing. Right at this very moment, there's a scent of mutiny in the Russian army. A soldier directly warned Putin that his own soldiers' weapons could be turned against the Kremlin.
Vladimir Vladimirovich, pay attention to this. Invite me to see you. The consequences will be very serious. If I do not manage to come to the Kremlin in the near future, and if I am not able to stand beside you and speak on a live broadcast, right there next to you, then the army will ultimately turn its weapons against the Kremlin. This is a warning that should not be ignored. That's all from me.
As it became known, an occupier from the Voronezh region, Alexander Lunin, who fought against Ukraine in the 150th Motorized Rifle Division and was wounded, made a bold statement. In his video, he accused the command of harsh treatment of the military and stated that many soldiers are held in inhuman conditions and subjected to violence by their own command.
They were punished for refusing to follow what they believed were foolish and even dangerous orders that could have put their lives at serious risk. They also refused to hand over their financial resources, choosing instead to protect what they had earned, despite being pressured to give it up. And ultimately, they are zeroed out, made missing in action.
The video clip instantly went viral. It has already been viewed by 7 million people.
In another video, Lunin states that this is not a bluff, and if something happens to him or his family, it will be a signal to start actions.
It seems this story is already going far beyond ordinary dissatisfaction in the Russian army. Is the ghost of a new mutiny hanging over Moscow again? Let's follow the development of events. What a turn from Lukashenko. The self-proclaimed leader of Belarus stated that he allegedly recently had contacts with representatives of Volodymyr Zelenskyy. According to him, during the conversation, he asked to convey only one message to the Ukrainian president. Time to negotiate, not act on emotions.
Let's, guys, negotiate. We need to negotiate substantially. No need to get heated, shout, or hit in the face. Let's do it humanely. Understanding what Russia is and what we are. There is such an understanding too. There's no need to drag us into the war. We don't want to fight with Ukrainians. Our position is peace-loving, but in any situation, we will be alongside Russia.
As we can see in Minsk, they are again trying to play their own diplomatic game, making statements that immediately attract attention on both sides of the border. And here the most interesting part begins. Lukashenko called on the Russian ambassador Boris Gryzlov not to drag Belarus into the war against Ukraine. The level of tension is higher than ever. Now this information will definitely reach Putin.
Lukashenko emphasized that Belarus does not need to get involved in the war. And there's no need to push us here into what Boris Vyacheslavovich is organizing, a process to drag us into the war, he said. Citing Lukashenko's quote, the Belarusian state agency Belta clarified that he was addressing the Russian ambassador to Belarus, Boris Gryzlov. The Russian state agency TASS did not include this quote in its publications about the meeting between Gryzlov and Lukashenko.
And the first results of establishing distance between Lukashenko and Putin are already becoming noticeable. Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated that the repeaters mentioned earlier are no longer working. Moreover, according to the Belarusian publication Flagshtok, Russian drones have stopped patrolling along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border in recent days. Whether this is a coincidence or the result of decisions not yet made public, the question remains open. We're keeping our finger on the pulse. This is truly historic news. The United States has officially sided with Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron made this statement, revealing shocking details of a geopolitical shift.
They are no longer a neutral mediator, but stand together with us on the issue of supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, providing military aid, energy support, and sanctions against Russia.
Directly from the French leader, it became known that a text was adopted in which Washington recognizes itself as Kyiv's partner. According to him, European leaders at the G7 summit managed to find common ground with the US authorities.
We signed a document that includes 200 projects and 60 million in joint investments, which again shows the convergence of positions between European and American partners. But likely, more twists and turns await us once again.
Signals that cannot be hidden, Trump's rhetoric regarding Ukraine is starting to sound different. The focus is shifting, the wording is getting tougher, and the topic of war itself is no longer presented as secondary. And this creates a new intrigue. Whether it's about situational political rhetoric or a deeper shift in the approach to the Ukrainian issue, time will tell. In Moscow, security measures are being sharply tightened. The capital of the Russian Federation is being hastily saturated with air defense systems, as if the threat is already at the city's doorstep. What was recently presented as a deep rear today looks completely different. And the more actively the authorities try to demonstrate control, the more it looks like a reaction to growing risks. The only question is, what exactly forced the Kremlin to change priorities so sharply and start preparing for the worst-case scenarios? Don't miss more on this ahead. The war that the Kremlin planned to wage far from its own borders is increasingly knocking right at the door of the Russian capital. After a series of strikes on the Moscow oil refinery, the Russian military deployed real forests of air defense systems around the facility. At the highest points near the plant, pantsers appeared one after another, as if it were not a rear facility in the center of the country, but a frontline zone. It is particularly telling that to protect the Moscow refinery, the Russians had to urgently transfer anti-aircraft systems from other directions. And here the most interesting part begins. After all, every new panzer placed to guard the capital's oil reservoirs automatically stops covering some other military facility, warehouse, airfield, or industrial enterprise. It turns out to be a classic Russian dilemma. If you close the holes around Moscow, they become even larger somewhere else.
What does this mean? First, as we can see in Moscow, air defense doesn't help. And second, other strategic facilities, including refineries and ports, will remain naked without protection and cover.
Overall, the picture for the Kremlin is looking increasingly alarming. What was recently presented as a symbol of absolute security and control is gradually turning into a fortress under siege. The Russian authorities continue to talk about successfully repelled attacks, but at the same time, layers of air defense systems are being set up around strategic sites. And when the capital of the world's largest country starts feverishly covering its own oil refinery, it shows not confidence in its strength, but an increasing fear that the next strike could turn out to be even more painful. While new air defense batteries are feverishly deployed near strategic sites, officials are increasingly choosing a different tactic for protecting the population. Simply not informing the public about the danger, The logic is simple and, in its own way, brilliant. If you don't turn on the siren, then maybe the problem will just go away on its own. The situation during one of the largest drone attacks on Moscow and the region was particularly telling. Many residents said they woke up not from an alarm or a threat notification, but from explosions outside their windows. The sirens were silent. There were no SMS warnings, even though the authorities had previously spent hundreds of millions of rubles on the alert system. It seems the main purpose of this system is not to warn of danger, but to look good in budget reports about its existence.
There was no air raid alert in Moscow, no SMS warnings about the attack were sent, residents of the capital's south reported. They woke up from explosions and sirens. Just in case, they took the children to the bathroom, away from the windows. They're scared, they were crying, says a Muscovite living about 3 kilometers from the attacked refinery. Meanwhile, in 2023 and 2024, the city authorities spent 171 million rubles on the public alert system for emergencies. During previous raids, it wasn't turned on either.
The explanations from Russian officials look even more interesting. In different regions, the refusal to sound alarms is justified in various ways. In some places, they fear panic. In others, they talk about the public getting used to it. And in some, they've decided that drones are not a serious enough reason for civil defense. A paradoxical situation is emerging. Drones regularly attack targets in the Russian rear, but the authorities try to convince citizens there's nothing to worry about. The situation in the Moscow region itself looks most symbolic. There, local authorities are sometimes in no hurry to reveal the addresses of shelters, citing a desire not to cause panic. In fact, Russians are being offered a rather unusual security model. Don't report the threat, don't mention shelters, and if something happens, deal with it after the explosions. And the longer the war lasts, the more this whole system starts to resemble not civil defense, but an attempt to hide the scale of problems closing in on Russia at any cost.
Essentially, all these explanations boil down to one common denominator. The scale of strikes on Russian territory is now so large that silent sirens are no longer a matter of logistics. Now it's a matter of political survival for a regime that spent years building an image of a war that doesn't affect ordinary Russians.
Meanwhile, the good old fuel crisis in Russia isn't showing any signs of receding either. While the Kremlin keeps talking about economic resilience and more victories over sanctions, the reality looks more and more like an emergency survival mode. Following the strikes on oil refineries, logistics issues, and rising prices, fuel shortages are starting to reach even those places where it was recently seen as a guaranteed resource. The situation in Russian light aviation has become particularly telling. Due to rising costs and aviation fuel shortages, some operators have already begun experimenting with refueling planes with regular car gasoline. It sounds as if a country dreaming of new supersonic missiles and space breakthroughs suddenly decided to see if they could fly on whatever's left after filling up the family sedan. And Russian market participants themselves are openly warning about the risks. Using lower quality fuel can lead to engine problems, loss of thrust, and other unpleasant surprises while in the air. But the options are becoming increasingly limited. In some regions, fuel tankers have already stopped providing planes with extra fuel reserves, leaving only the bare minimum required for the flight. In other words, the safety margin is slowly vanishing even where it was always considered a given. An equally alarming sign is that Russia is now seriously discussing state price controls for aviation fuel. And here, a paradox familiar to the Russian economy emerges. When officials try to fight shortages with administrative measures, the shortages often only get worse. Even Russian experts warn that you can set a nice low price on paper, but that won't actually create more fuel. All of this paints a rather unpleasant picture for the Kremlin. While more air defense systems are moved to Moscow and authorities fear sounding sirens during attacks, the fuel crisis continues to slowly erode the economy from within. While the war's impact was once measured by refinery explosions and rising gas prices, it's now increasingly affecting aviation as well. This looks like yet another symptom that the war is becoming far more costly for Russia than the Kremlin initially anticipated. Putin's empire is sinking in disasters. How much longer can it stay afloat? It's only a matter of time. What a development! The West has essentially solidified its position, and it's not what the Kremlin was hoping for. While Moscow keeps talking about partner fatigue, support for Ukraine is not only holding firm but becoming more strategic in nature. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is increasingly seen as a key figure in shaping Europe's new security architecture. It seems a lasting political trend is emerging. More on that in just a moment, so stay tuned. Even the West is no longer hiding it. Zelenskyy is becoming a leader whose decisions increasingly shape the future of all of Europe. And while the Kremlin still dreams of Ukraine's surrender, Zelenskyy's global influence has grown so much that he's now called a key player on the world stage. Financial Times columnist Edward Luce concluded that it's hard to find another politician today with such a profound impact on the future of European security. Moreover, the author suggests a rather ironic scenario. Zelenskyy could politically outlast both Putin and even Trump. This looks especially ironic given the Kremlin's long-term predictions of the supposedly rapid fall of the Ukrainian government. In Moscow, they've waited for years for the West to tire, for Ukraine to crumble, and for Zelenskyy to vanish from major politics. But while Russian propagandists continue to paint these fantasies on their TV broadcasts, reality is unfolding in the opposite direction. It is Kyiv that increasingly influences discussions about the future of NATO, Europe's new security architecture, and even what the European Union will look like in the coming decades. The Financial Times points to yet another inconvenient fact for many. While governments change in leading Western countries, political crises become almost commonplace, and voters increasingly support radical forces. Zelenskyy continues to demonstrate consistency in his goals. In fact, a paradoxical situation has emerged. A country that has been fighting a war for survival for 4 years now often sounds more confident about Europe's future than many European capitals. The Kremlin is not thrilled because the war that was supposed to return Ukraine to the Russian sphere of influence has yielded the exact opposite result. Instead of an isolated state, Moscow got a Ukraine without which it's increasingly difficult to imagine Europe's future security system. And Zelenskyy, from a politician predicted to have only weeks in power, has become a key participant in the discussion about the future of the entire West. And it seems this isn't the only bad news for Putin. While Moscow tries to convince the world that time is on Russia's side, Washington is looking ever more closely at the results of the Ukrainian army. According to the Financial Times, recent Ukrainian strikes on Russian military targets made such a strong impression on Donald Trump that the Kremlin has already begun openly talking about a shift in the American position. And judging by the nervous reaction of Russian officials, they understand perfectly well how this might end. Lavrov's reaction was particularly telling. The head of the Russian Foreign Ministry essentially complained that Washington no longer acts as an objective mediator and is moving further away from the positions that Moscow had so heavily relied on. In other words, the Kremlin is beginning to realize the unpleasant reality. The bet that the new American administration would force Kyiv to make concessions may ultimately fail. According to the Financial Times, during the G7 summit, Trump was extremely impressed by Ukraine's campaign of long-range strikes on Russian territory. Moreover, it was after these events that Washington began to question Russia's ability to achieve its strategic goals in the war. And this is already a serious blow to the main Kremlin narrative, which for years was built around the thesis of a supposedly inevitable Russian victory. No less alarming for Moscow is the fact that, in parallel, strengthening sanctions against the Russian energy sector is being discussed, as well as new formats of military support for Ukraine. In Kyiv, they're already speaking of cautious optimism regarding the supply of missiles for Patriot and even the possible launch of their production in Europe and Ukraine. And this means the Kremlin risks getting the very scenario it feared most. A Ukraine that not only continues to fight but also gradually builds up its capabilities with Western support. The ultimate irony is that until recently, Russian propaganda claimed almost daily there was a looming rift between Kyiv and Washington. But today, the situation looks exactly the opposite. The more successful the Ukrainian forces are, the more often the West speaks about the need for further support for Ukraine. And the louder the Kremlin complains about losing an objective mediator, the more obvious it is that Moscow is losing much more faith that it can pressure Ukraine into its terms. And while the Kremlin reacts nervously to the shift in mood in Washington, another telling signal emerges. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte confirmed that active work on a potential peace deal is already underway with members of Trump's team, Marco Rubio and Jared Kushner. In other words, talk of ending the war is gradually moving from mere declarations to concrete negotiation mechanisms. But there is one problem, and that problem sits in the Kremlin. Rutte stated directly that advancing the peace process is only possible if Putin is ready to work on real agreements. However, for now, the Russian dictator continues to insist on his maximalist demands. And here a rather strange picture emerges. Moscow speaks of negotiations more and more often, but at the same time continues to set conditions that make them practically impossible. It seems the Kremlin is trying to both escape the war's consequences and pretend they can still dictate the rules of the game. At the same time, Rutte's words came against the backdrop of statistics even more painful for Moscow. According to NATO estimates, Ukrainian forces disable between 30 to 35,000 Russian troops every month, killed or wounded. This is no longer about isolated losses or failed operations, but about the systemic exhaustion of the Russian military machine. Moreover, according to the alliance's chief, Ukraine's strikes are hitting not just the army, but Russia's economy more and more, specifically through attacks on energy infrastructure and oil refining capacities. While Ukraine expands its strike capabilities deep into the Russian rear, boosts cooperation with allies, and keeps the initiative on key fronts, the Kremlin is forced to spend more effort on protecting its infrastructure, compensating for losses and patching new holes. What was once presented as a quick campaign increasingly resembles a long-term attrition, the cost of which for Russia grows every month. And if current trends continue, the main threat to Moscow won't even be individual strikes or local failures at the front. The most dangerous factor could be the gradual buildup of problems across all areas: military, logistics, economy, and international politics. After all, history has proven repeatedly, major conflicts are often decided not during the loudest battles, but when one side can no longer sustain the level of tension it created itself. And that concludes our broadcast. We're continuing right now. Stay tuned for the latest events so we can bring them to you first. Don't forget to subscribe. See you soon!